Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I'm excited to talk with the author of a collection of stories about women pilots in Florida. She Soars, Trailblazing Female Pilots in Florida. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the literary aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Lucille Ponte, welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz, for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk to you about this book. This is such a special book. And just to be clear, that it's She Soars, Trailblazing Female Pilots in Florida, which is amazing. I live in South Florida, and so this is very near and dear to my heart. So yeah, no, I'm super excited about it. Super excited about the names in it. But the book is written under a pen name, Bridges DelPonte, for anybody who is looking for it. So before we get into talking about you and talking about the book, would you give us a quick summary of the book and maybe do a reading?
Sure. The book itself is 14 separate stories of trailblazing female pilots. And some of the pilots were born in Florida and made their mark in aviation history. Others came to Florida to make their mark in the aviation. So you have both people who were born in Florida and those outside, but they all made their mark here in Florida. And I group it by time period. So it starts as early as the 1912 area, all the way up to 2017. So we take women from the time period of when planes were these rickety things made out of wire and fabric, all the way up to people in F-15 fighter jets now that are very technologically advanced. So it's a great way to kind of see not just the progress of aviation and the technology, but women's role in that field over time. And it's 14 different stories. It's an anthology. And it was tough to come up with 14 because there were so many ladies I could have put in the book, but I had to decide, okay, who are going to be sort of the top 14 that were in it. And they did everything from being the first female to fly at night, like a Ruth Law, all the way to the first to pilot and command the space shuttle, like Eileen Collins. So we have quite a bit. We have Jackie Cochran broke the sound barrier. We have Patty Wagstaff, the first woman to ever win the National Aerobatic Championships, where men and women were competing against each other. And she did that multiple times. And we just have all of these women who did incredible things in aviation, who showed a lot of courage, who showed a lot of determination to kind of buck the trend of the day, because a lot of people were like, oh, no, women should not be doing this. Or even their own families disapproved of what they were doing, but they were willing to go ahead. So they all are 14 different women, their various stories of courage, how they kind of buck the trends of society and sometimes even their own families. And basically it's grouped by time period, so we can see their development over time.
Awesome. And so you have a reading prepared for us?
I do. I have a reading for each of the chapters in She Soars. What I do is I take a famous quote from that woman that kind of reflects her image. And then I'll give you an excerpt from chapter 5 about Jackie Cochran, who a lot of people know. And her quote was, "I might have been born in a hovel, but I determined to travel with the wind and the stars." And she had a lot of determination. So let me read a little bit about Jacqueline Cochran, from panhandle poverty to international aviation fame. She claimed not to know her actual birth date or where exactly she was born, the identities of her biological parents, and even what her real name was. She contended that her early beginnings reflected the deprivations of a Dickens novel, with daily hunger, flour sack clothing, wooden pallets for beds, and deplorable child labor conditions. But by the end of her life, her chosen name remained on the lips of presidents, first ladies, prime ministers, generals, CEOs, and celebrities. Jackie Cochran. And the whole chapter goes into how she came from this terrible background where she was working 16-hour days as a child to then becoming an international superstar. And in there, she got married. She had a child who died very tragically in a fire. And then, basically on impulse, at the age of 23, Jackie sold her Model T, packed up her belongings, and bought a one-way ticket to New York City in 1929. She wrote that despite the nation's financial crash, it was a year of great growth for me. To potential salon employers, and she was a beautician, she now introduced herself as Jacqueline Cochran. So she was known as Bessie Pittman through her foster parents, but she changed her name. And she later claimed she randomly chose the name out of the phone book, omitting her marriage to Robert Cochran, which ended in divorce in 1927. Over time, Jackie continued to mix fact and fiction in creating her carefully honed image. So her whole life, nobody knows what the true story was about Jackie Cochran's early beginnings. So much so that when she married for a second time to a very wealthy man, she gave him an envelope on their wedding day. She said she had had a private investigator investigate her own past so she would even know her. She didn't know herself was one of her beginnings. She didn't look at it. She gave it to him and said, before you marry me, I want you to know everything about me. She gave it to him. Upon his death, they were married for many years, like 30 or 40 years later. When he passed away, she was going through his things. He had never opened it up.
Huh.
And she had the option herself. At that time, she was great friends with Chuck Yeager. He had trained her to help her break the sound barrier. He said to her, well, do you want to open it and find out yourself about your past? She said, no, we're going to burn it. She burned it, and she never even found out the truth of her own past. So she was a woman of mystery who mixed a lot of fact and fiction with who she was.
Well, since you started with her with the reading, I just want to say that she's obviously a name that comes up in all of our readings of, whether it's the 1940s and thinking about the World War II and the WASP, or, further along when we were talking about the women who tested for the space program in the 1960s, early 1960s. And so she is a figure that definitely looms large, but is also very controversial. And we always have
very controversial. Later in her life, she was not very supportive of women in the military or women entering the military academies or even women in space. And there was always a divided view of it. Some said, well, she wanted the standards to be exactly identical. Others said they were where everybody's got an ego, you're allowed to have an ego. And her view was, hey, I don't want anybody to surpass me by becoming astronauts and things like that. Because when she died, she had more aviation records than any human, man or woman, on the planet. And so some thought she was afraid she would lose her place in history, which she never did, by being overshadowed by these women who came later, like an Eileen Collins, who piloted and commanded the space shuttle.
No, I mean, her records stand, and however she was able to achieve those, whether it was her access, obviously, to wealth, and the way that she endeared herself to the men around her, including Chuck Yeager, to be able to do those things. I mean, nobody could take that away from her, but it doesn't change the fact that she's a very controversial.
Yes, she's always been a controversial, and she was controversial in her day. I mean, when they were trying to decide who was going to head up the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. She got into a little bit of a dispute with Nancy Love, who was also a very well-known pilot of the day, who had a military background. And some people said, some of the folks that they talked to at that time said, Jackie Cochran's personality was like sandpaper.
Yeah.
You rubbed the wrong way all the time.
That definitely comes across in the things that we read about her. So I'm fascinated with what inspired you here. So I need to know more about you, about Lou Ponte. Tell me about your background and then how that led you to these stories.
Sure, Liz. Well, basically, my background was that I was a lawyer by training, and I practiced law for about 6 or 7 years, and then I became an academic and taught legal studies and at law schools for the next 31 plus years.
Wow.
And in that time period, you have to do a lot of, it's the publish-or-perish environment of academia, so you have to publish. And at that time, I was very interested in the way legally women were being treated in the military. They were treated very unfairly. Oftentimes, they did not receive the same benefits as men. They didn't have the same opportunities. They were not allowed at one point in time to even be in the military academies. So I wrote a number of different articles advocating for them to have a more equal role in the military. And so through that, I became aware of the WASPs. and other women who had served and done unusual things in the military. So I was always sort of interested, and I wrote a number of different articles. I got this T-shirt, believe it or not. You would say it's a vintage today. Some would say it's an old T-shirt, but it's stayed in pretty good shape. I got it in 1997. My sister, Dolores, basically she knew I was writing quite a bit about women in the military and about the women pilots of the era and how they were being treated. And there was an exhibit at the Smithsonian called Women Fly.
Very
And it was
cool.
all black and white photographs of women. And she bought me this T-shirt. And so I had it for a number of years. And then out of the blue, this is such a strange thing, Liz. This never happens. I've been writing for years and years, both in law and in business, and I've done fiction work. So I have a long career of writing. I got an email from someone saying, "Oh, hi, we see you write nonfiction. Might you be interested in pitching some stories of nonfiction, for a book?" And I'm like, is this a scam? Like, are they going to ask me for my passwords next and my
Yeah.
bank codes? Or I didn't know what it was because it never happens. No one ever reaches out to you as a writer in that way to ask you for a book. So I checked it out. There's a press. This is the one that published She Soars. It's called Pineapple Press. It's a Florida-based publisher, and they were looking for people to do Florida-based stories. So they said, well, can you pitch us a couple of things? I thought, you know what? All those years of writing about the WASP and writing about women in the military, I said, well, I'd like to do something about trailblazing female pilots in Florida. There's so many of them. There's a long history in Florida of great aviation history for men and women. And then I also gave them the silent movie era in Jacksonville, which is where I had previously lived. And they picked the women pilots. They said, all right, give us the women pilots. And that's what led to the book being published. It took me about a little over a year to do all the research. And then, of course, they do their editing and their book covers and all that. And it came out in September of 2024. So they reached out to me, which was so unusual for something like this.
That's so
T-shirt came in
fantastic.
handy again. I said to my sister, that T-shirt lives on forever. 1997, still doing his business.
Good luck. Oh my gosh. Okay, so do you feel like any of the writing that you did about the women? So just most of my listeners know this. I don't know if you know, but I am retired Coast Guard, so I'm grateful for all the
Fantastic.
advocacy.
There's some great Coast Guard ladies in here.
Yeah, so I appreciated I appreciate like the advocacy that you were doing and just thinking about like my career in the Coast Guard was limited by plenty of things. However, it was never limited the way that the other services were, in terms of operational roles, them being left out of combat. And so I didn't have that issue, but it was something that I cared a lot about on their behalf. And so did you feel like any of the writing that you did had any actual impact on policy?
Well, you hope it does, because what happens is when these articles get published, they get published in law reviews, and that's read by law clerks, by judges all across the country. And so
Right.
that becomes an aspect of it. It does also get the debate going. I did get a couple of not very friendly phone calls at the college, especially when I wrote about women getting into the military academies. I had some alum from the Virginia Military Institute call me and tell me I was a terrible person and I was trying to ruin their academy by trying to bring women in. And I calmed them down and I explained to them, if women want to serve, don't you want people who are patriots? Don't you want people who want to do a good job? Don't you want people who wish to become members of the military? And a lot of them calmed down but a lot of it, there was a lot of pushback. I think it was a lot of kind of traditional thinking about the role of women. So I do hope it was helpful. I did write an article right before the Supreme Court handed down the decision saying that the Virginia Military Institute would have to integrate and allow women in and not have a separate academy for women, that they were allowed to attend the same academy as men. So you're always hoping that these articles are being written by people who are legal scholars, and hopefully they recognize what you're saying as important. So I
What
kind of
year
got
was the
to be
VMI
known for
issue?
that for a while. I wrote even editorials in the paper, in the Virginia papers, which they were not happy about, but there you go.
What year was the VMI issue?
The VMI, that goes back to, I have to go back and look at it, but the VMI was probably, I think it was the late 90s at that point.
Wow.
Yeah, so there was a lot of people who were pretty upset about the fact that women might actually get into the military academies. And I was like,
Well, women
People
were
want to
already
get
in the
into them.
military
What's the
academies
problem?
since the 1970s, so that's odd. But yeah,
Right. Well, I think what it was this idea that some of these organizations for a long time, women who had signed up to be in the service, for example, the first six, I talk about Judith Newfer Bruner,
right.
who basically did go into the Coast Guard. She was part of the first six women that were even allowed to train as pilots. Because what happened was that there was, until I think it
She
was
was in the
19,
Navy.
right.
Yeah,
Well, actually, the Navy was the first, so going to give the Navy credit. And then I
yeah,
think she went on to be a hurricane hunter and did work with
correct.
the
Yeah,
Coast Guard
she's
that way.
Navy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So she started in the Navy, and that was back, I think, in 1993. So I think
Oh,
part of it was the women they were the first six women who were allowed to train as pilots, because prior to that, the combat exclusion provisions in the law prevented a woman from training on anything that might remotely be used in combat. So even if
it,
you weren't going to go into combat, even as a man, you could train, but as a woman, you couldn't, because there might be a chance that that jet or that plane might be used in combat. So that was 1993.
and interestingly, like the thing that you brought up about you being invited to write this book, we have another writer in our group, Bev Weintraub, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist
Oh,
who wrote an article about the missing man formation flown all by women for Rosemary Mariner, and then she was invited to write a book about the early Navy pilots, and her story is in that as well.
oh,
So
terrific.
that's fascinating. So let's talk about some of these incredible women that you included in this book, and I think you start with Ruth Law, which interestingly,
Yeah.
my friends, I do a conversation series in my podcast with these two well-respected women in our community, Dr. Jackie Boyd and Captain Jenny Beatty. We call it Literary Aviatrix Classics.
Oh,
And we're
great.
kind of still sort of mulling around in the golden age of aviation. And the whole point of our efforts is to go look at source material for which I couldn't, interview the author. And Ruth Law came up when we were talking the other day about what a fascinating character she was. So tell us a little bit about Ruth and her relationship with Florida.
Yeah. Well, Ruth Law, part of it too is that Florida has, I think, this history of aviation experiences, because in that time period, you have to realize the early days of flight, there were not airports and there were not that many airfields. So if you were going to have a smooth takeoff and landing, you needed some kind of hard surface somewhere. So beaches became a natural place. So Daytona became this place where they were experimenting with flying. And one of Ruth Law, who grew up in my home state of Massachusetts, but then went down to Daytona Beach for 3 seasons. I think it was 1913 through 1915. She was the first woman to basically be a flight instructor, because she was so good at what she did. And when she originally wanted to fly, she bought a plane. She bought a Wright Model B from the Wright brothers, but Orville Wright refused to train her because he said women didn't have the physical or mental capabilities to fly a plane. So he wouldn't teach her, but of
Right.
course he was a businessman, so he sold her a plane. She went up to Saugus, Massachusetts. That's where she got all of her training. She became a pilot. Then she came down. One of her instructors said, "Hey, they're looking for people to give like tourist rides." So Florida's long been a tourist haven, as you know, in part because of its beaches. But at that time, people were thinking, what's a fun thing to do on vacation? Now, remember, vacation was for the wealthy back in those days. So it was people
Right.
with a lot of money. So what she did is she gave people rides. The rides were about, I wrote it down because it's hilarious in a way, 10 to 15 minutes over Daytona Beach, anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 square feet, 2,000 feet in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So you were up pretty high. And it was $15 a person, which at that time was about $475. So it was not a cheap thing in today's money.
Yeah.
So basically, Ruth became the first woman, and all the newspapers went crazy for her, Liz. Like, oh my gosh, there's a woman who's going to fly. But Ruth Law, later on, Orville's brother, Wilbur, said Orville was wrong. She was one of the nerviest and bravest pilots that ever lived. And she did something called the dip of death, where she would speed the plane down, just about to crash into the sand and come swooping back up again. She was also the first person to fly at night. She broke the record nonstop from Chicago to New York, and she became the toast of New York City. So much so that President Wilson and his wife threw a reception for her. And she ended up later on trying to be a pilot in World War I. They wouldn't let her because women were not allowed, but she was allowed to wear a military uniform, which was very unusual at that time. So she flew around the country trying to sell Liberty bonds. But Ruth Law was, we would say she was a superstar celebrity in the day. She was on the front page of the New York Times just about every week.
Amazing.
Nobody knows her now, but she was incredibly famous in her day, so much so that when she finally continued and she couldn't get into the military and she ended up in these different, she had the Ruth Law Flying Circus, she was making the equivalent of $300,000 a week today. She was that popular. Okay, she's making $9,000, which is about $290,000 a week in today's money.
Holy cow.
Because she was a superstar. But today, very few people know about her.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I'm so glad that you dedicated a chapter to her and that you started the book with her. And then in the second chapter, you move on to a name I had never heard before. Her name is Bessie Smith Prescott.
Yes, Bessie Smith. She was quite a character.
Tell us about her. It says a Florida-born pioneer in the sky and the great outdoors.
Correct. She grew up basically in the I would say the back country, the swamp country of Florida. And she grew up, and she would say, hunting and fishing are better than kissing. And she basically was a fantastic outdoors woman. But she was interested in, it was interesting to me, a lot of these women, Liz, Jackie Cochran, Bessie Coleman, who passed here in Florida, Desi, they were all beauticians. And I think it's because it was a field where you could, as a woman, be independent and manage your own business. So she started as a beautician, but then she saw planes flying and thought, I think I can do that. So she became the first woman in Florida. Now, for a long time, the only way to get a license to fly was through a private club. But over time, the federal government stepped in and started to set standards, safety standards, quality standards, certification standards. Right. She was the third person to get third woman to get a license from the federal government and the first in Florida to do so. Cool. And she was with a flying circus. That's what they called it in those days. And she was a part of a troupe called the Wild Hogs, because there's a lot, if you know, if anyone knows anything about Florida, there's still a lot of boar and wild hog in the center of the state that are running around from the old days of the Spanish explorers that are still there. And so that was the name of the troupe. And she was with them for a while, but then she said, I could see that most of the mechanics were drunk most of the time. So I decided maybe that's not going to be my long-term career. So she did get back into she became the first licensed fishing and hunting guide as a woman in Florida. And she became great friends she had Babe Ruth at one point in time at her hunting resort. So she knew celebrities from all over. But many people don't know that name today. And she lived into her late 80s, and she was well known in Citrus County for her hunting and fishing work. So that's where she was, as she would say, she was one tough hombre, because she was also in the military. She also helped those train in the military for flight. So she was quite a lady.
Yeah. And she went through 6 husbands.
I always say she outlasted 6 husbands.
That's right. That's crazy. Well, then you get into Bessie Coleman, who we know a lot about, but I thought that the details especially about her last days here in Florida, those were things that I hadn't seen before. You wanted to just talk about a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do, Liz. I think the fascinating thing is I thought, well, I wonder if Bessie Coleman had much of a footprint here. And it turned out that she had come here a number of times for different shows, because she was also a superstar in her time period. Mm-hmm. And she was a person who would not allow the shows to be segregated. And this was a big deal. If you think about we're talking 1920s, the KKK was still active. It was the Jim Crow South. You had this strict segregation based on race. And she would say she was going to do a show in Orlando, and it was for the Chamber of Commerce at that time. And they said, well, we're going to segregate. She said, you do that, I won't be there. And they were like, what? So they ended up allowing people to enter in an integrated way. That took a lot of guts, because in that time period, you could be harmed for that kind of outspoken advocacy. But the interesting part is that she met the couple, the Reverend and Mrs. Hill, in Orlando, and she became a born-again Christian there. And she wrote them a letter, which they read posthumously. They didn't get it until after she had died in her accident in Jacksonville, basically saying that the happiest times of her life were in Orlando. And
Wow.
she was hoping to start her school for African American pilots. She herself could not train in the US. No one would train her. She had to learn French, go to France, and get her education there so she could learn to fly, and became this superstar. She was hoping to start the school. Her last show was going to be in Jacksonville. She was not going to actually be flying the plane. She was going to do a parachute jump, which was also pretty risky in those days. And there was an accident with the plane. She was not flying. Somebody else did. The plane flipped and she died.
Yeah.
And she did not have the chance. But there was a huge outpouring from the African American community. She was a huge hero at that time.
Of course.
Very little ripple in the press of the mainstay press at that time, which is crazy. And even the New York Times only corrected it back, I think, in 2013 or something. They put in an obituary for her that they should have at the time of her death. And it's so fascinating to me that she had this amazing career, was not recognized much at the time, but her legacy has been so strong.
Yeah, that was actually that little tidbit about the New York Times in their overlooked quote unquote section. They decide to finally print something that's incredible.
It does blow the mind.
Yeah, it really does.
But it was
Now,
beautiful how she was carried from, in Jacksonville, there was a huge funeral, then by train to Orlando, and another huge funeral procession there. And then on the train to Chicago, people sang America the Beautiful as the train left the station. So
yeah.
really a beautiful story of her
Yeah.
legacy as it carried on through the centuries.
I really loved what you did with kind of drawing that last period out about her, because I hadn't read that anywhere else. So thank you for that. And then we get to another Ruth Nichols, whose name comes up also quite a lot because she was an air racer and had all of her contemporaries are well-known names. You want to talk about Ruth Nichols?
Yes, Ruth Nichols was known in her time. The press always loves a good nickname. They called her the Flying Debutante, and she hated that name. She hated that she came from a wealthy family.
Yeah.
She just wanted to be herself. And so what had happened was that her mother was pressing her to find a rich husband. And she had taken flying lessons in Miami on the fly. Her parents had no idea that she had taken these lessons. They thought she was down there filling up her dance card and finding her future husband in the winter season in Miami, down where you are. And basically her parents thought, oh, she's finally going to find a husband. Nope, she was busy taking seaplane lessons and became one of the first women to fly a seaplane.
She was using her time wisely.
Yeah, she used her time wisely while she's here in Florida. She got her license then. And then when she went back to New York, her parents said, no, none of this flying business. And they made her work in a bank because they thought she was going to meet a rich banker husband. Her father was in finance. And one night she told her parents, oh, I won't be home. I'm going to be going out late with friends. And she got on a plane with a co-pilot, and she and the co-pilot had the first nonstop flight from New York to Miami. And her father only found out about it when he opened up the New York Times and saw his daughter's name and face plastered on the front page of the New York Times. She had just broken this record.
Good.
And she went on later to be the first woman to try to do a transatlantic flight. She did not have success because of a crash in Canada, but Amelia Earhart, who was her close friend, also learned from that and decided to have herself towed up there to a safer spot, and then flew from Canada, and then, of course, made the famous flight. But she would go on later to be one of the founders of the 99s. I know there's a lot of members of the 99s here and across the country. Yeah. And she also had, her background was as a Quaker. And she said, I'm always trying to balance what I'm supposed to do as a Quaker with my adventurous spirit. So she ended up doing a lot of compassionate humanitarian flights during World War II. And it was basically called World War II Relief Wings, where she brought food and medicine to those who had suffered from the ravages of World War II, particularly children. So she had a long career as a humanitarian. And then later on, she actually did break a sound. She broke a speed record in her 50s, 59 she did this, and then went on to actually do the testing to be an astronaut, which she passed, but they would not let her continue because she was not the right age. She was over 35 and they would not let her. And that I think really did her in, because she felt like this was her goal, was to be an astronaut at some point in time. She had done all of this amazing work as a pilot. So. It was
Yeah,
a very tragic end for her.
and she did that testing at Cape Canaveral, according to your writing.
Yes, Cape Canaveral and several other places as well, but yes. So she basically had done the test to prove that she could be an astronaut, but they said we were limiting it to people over 35, and you had to have had a jet pilot license, which women couldn't get at that time because only men were allowed to do that, both in the military and in private commercial aviation.
That's right. And but what I thought was interesting is that she wasn't one of the Mercury 13,
No, no, no,
quote unquote. Yeah.
no.
So
She was actually
that's
a little bit
interesting.
around that time period, but she
Yeah,
was not one
yeah.
of them.
Well, then we already talked about Jackie Cochran, who comes next in the book, and then we get to a really fun character, I think, Betty Skelton.
Oh, Betty
Um,
Skelton is, can I tell you, I think of all the pilots, I think she had the happiest life from beginning to end.
I mean, it sounds like it from the
Oh,
outside
yeah, it
looking
sounds
in,
like she had
doesn't
a
it?
fantastic life. And then basically, Betty was, she was as a child, her parents said she was in the stroller reaching for planes because they were in Pensacola. That's where she was born.
Right.
And they were seeing all those Navy jets flying. And they said she was constantly begging them to take her to the local airport so she could watch planes taking off and landing. And she was such a character that people started allowing. Now she's just like at age like 8 and 10. They allowed her to, her parents allowed her to bum rides with pilots who would then take her up and showed her how to fly until finally a Navy pilot said, "Who is this kid? Let me try to teach her." And he taught her and her family to become pilots. And she did her first solo, not legally. Okay. She did not do it legally. She was too young. I think she did it at 14. You had to wait till 16. But then eventually she did do it legally at age 16. And she was dying to be a WASP, Liz, dying to be. And she applied and she was too young. She had the
Yeah.
flight time because she flew all over the place, but she was too young. And then unfortunately they closed down before she had a chance. So she went into aerobatics.
Mm-hmm.
And it started totally by accident. I currently live in Punta Gorda, Florida. And
Okay.
that's where her accidental career kind of started, which is that there was a JC's charity show going to be in Punta Gorda, which is not far away from where her parents had relocated in Tampa. And they said, we got to make this thing like exciting. Like, why are people going to come to this air show? Oh, let's have this young woman who everybody knows flies a plane. Let's have her do some tricks. Well, she didn't know anything about it. So there was an old World War I flying ace in Tampa who said, "I'll teach you a few things." He taught her a few rolls. He taught her a few stunts. While she was there, she did it for free. She was doing it for fun. When she came down, the crowd had gone wild, and there was somebody there who said, "How much do you charge? Because I've got an air show coming up." And that was the beginning of her career. And she became the first person to win the National Female Aerobatic Championships 3 seasons in a row. And she became a superstar from that. But then couldn't make money on it
Yeah.
because they wouldn't allow her. She applied to all the airlines. They wouldn't take her because she was a woman. So she kind of was going to give up on that and decided, well, I'll do some charter flights out of North Carolina. She had some friends up there. And she ended up meeting the person who was Bill France Sr., the one who started NASCAR. And she told him all about her exciting aviation life. And he said, well, why don't we see how you do in a fast car? And soon she became breaking records on Daytona Beach. Again, Daytona, which is famous for both cars and for planes. She broke a bunch of records and ended up becoming kind of the face of Corvette. And when she passed away in her 80s, she died in the Villages, and she still drove a Corvette, by the way, until the day she died, a red Corvette. She basically, at that point in time, had more records in aviation and automotive records than any person alive, man
And
or
that was
woman.
in 2011. And I am so sad that I never got to meet her.
No, she was incredible. I said she must have been a hoot because she even got to see Eileen Collins command the space shuttle. She was invited amongst of the pioneering pilots to come.
Yeah.
And she said it was a great day for women to finally see them become the pilot and then ultimately the commander of the space shuttle.
Yeah,
She was
absolutely.
great. And she had, like I said, she was called the first lady of first because she did so many things first in both aviation and in the automotive industry.
Yeah, her character is a big happy one, I think, in our history, and I
Yeah.
definitely want this. This was a great chapter on her, and it makes me want so much more about her. It's so great. In the next chapter, you talk about another lady that I had never heard of, but I love and some stuff that I'd never heard at all. So it's so fascinating. Gladys Penny Thompson, her quote flying car stunt boosts women's air shows in Florida aviation. Tell us about Gladys, or
Yeah.
Penny, as she went.
Gladys Penny was Gladys. Her name was Gladys Pennington, but ultimately she got remarried. But so she was still went by the nickname Penny.
Uh-huh.
And she had been flying planes for a long time. She and came down to the Miami area because this was an aviation center, an aviation hub. She had done one of the first regular newsletters that was sent to private pilots about what was happening in aviation. So that was considered a big deal at that time. How do you get this information out? There was no internet then, folks. So you had to rely on the printed word. And she kind of created and edited this. And she had wanted, like a lot of women, to be involved in World War II. So she was part of the Civil Air Patrol off of the coast of Florida. So she did those patrols. And after World War II, there had been a number of what's called the Miami had these regularly all international maneuvers that were done in Miami. So it was a competition in which both the designers of planes and pilots came to show their stuff. So just do it as a huge trade show, but also it was an air show at the same time.
Right.
And the women had participated in it before World War II. But then after World War II, the men tried to shut them out and did not schedule any events. Well, Pennington, she was not going to have it, right? She said, nope. What, are you crazy? They were going to have something to honor the WASPs. And they were really angry that they decided not to shut the women out. So she said, you know what? You want to shut us out? Go right ahead. I am now going to start an all-woman air show, the first that was ever done, and they had it in Tampa. So Tampa was always happy because there were always a rivalry there with Miami. So they were happy to say, yes, we are the aviation capital. We invite all to come. So she organized the first all-woman show.
In 1947.
Yes, and it was incredible. And it had all of these great women from all around. There was races involved. There were stunts. There were trophies that were being offered, all of this stuff. And she organized it. And she was a marketing genius. So she did things like she flew all around Florida with this plane that basically was talking about the all-women air show. And then later on in the second air show, which was then Miami, was like, oh, we're missing out on something good here. Maybe we'll have that all-woman air show here next year, which they did. After shutting them out, they thought, we're missing out on something good here. She then ended up being one of the first to fly. And this is the time period. There's a lot of experimentation with cars and planes. Mm-hmm. And she borrowed and flew this plane that you then could also drive. So it was one that they flew it into Florida and then drove it.
Yeah.
And part of it was that as part of the race, you couldn't fly at night, but they didn't say you couldn't drive at night. So they did that. So she was very well known for that. And she really was a strong advocate for women. She was the president of the 99s in Miami. So she was a strong advocate for women pilots. And then later in her life became a strong environmentalist and really pushed for more green spaces in Florida and not having everything developed. And now she and her husband, who was also he was a newspaper man down in Miami who wrote about their family life, kind of a humorous column about their family and about her. And basically, in the end, when they both passed away, they named a park in Miami after them. So that the two of them now have this park named after them. So she has a legacy that continues. And that park is right near where she used to store her plane. So it's kind of a tip of the hat to her days as a pilot as well.
Oh, that's so cool. I'm
really
so glad
wonderful
to know about her. I wish I had known about her before. We talked a little bit about Captain Bruner, Captain Judith Neufer Bruner, who was in the Navy and became a hurricane hunter. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about her before we move on?
Well, the one thing I want to note is that a lot of, I think, especially young women today, don't realize the obstacles that women faced in the military. And when Judith Neufer at that time, before she got married, was trying to become she already had a pilot's background, but she was a computer programmer. She was not a pilot in the Navy. And when they opened up in 1993 the opportunity for women to at least train as pilots, but they were told, you're not going to get into combat. So just keep that out of your brain. And basically, all you're going to be allowed to do is to do transport. So you're going to basically move planes from one place to another or move cargo from one place to another. But Judith Newfer was part of that first six, but she was the one that said, well, I could be a hurricane hunter, and that's not a combat position. So they were like, oh, well, I guess we didn't think about that. We were just thinking of people like basically, hauling cargo from one place to another. She applied and she got in Jacksonville, and she became the first woman to fly into the center of a hurricane. And many years later, I saw her obituary, and they just briefly noted, oh, yeah, she had a great career as a pilot in the Navy. And I'm like, oh, my gosh. This woman basically opened the door for all other women to fly in the military. She got just barely a tip of the hat.
And
so I just wanted to make sure she wasn't forgotten as the first six.
No, yeah, and I appreciate that so much. And I just want to make sure that we're clear. It was 1973 that she was allowed to go to flight
Correct.
training.
Sorry, 1973.
Yeah, and then 1993
I'm confusing that with
combat.
1993 with the combat exclusions were lifted.
Sure
Thank you for that, Liz.
And I mentioned earlier this other book that goes into her and her contemporaries is Wings of Gold by Beverly Weintraub. It's excellent compliment to this story.
And then so 1973 she got to train. In 1974 she became the hurricane hunter.
Yeah.
And she actually flew into Hurricane Carmen, which is the hurricane featured in the film Forrest Gump, which it was the one that destroys all of the shrimp boaters except for his. So that is the actual hurricane that she flew into.
Yeah, he had a direct line to her, so he knew where to go. And now another familiar name that people will recognize, Captain Beverly Bass.
Yes.
Of the Come From Away fame from 9/11 is really fascinating. So tell us about her and her connections to Florida.
Well, she was born in Fort Myers. So her family had a big cattle ranch down in Southwest Florida. Mm-hmm. And when she said she wanted to become a pilot, they were very upset because she was involved in horse shows and things, and they wanted her to do stuff on the ranch. So she really had to kind of buck her parents on this one because they really didn't want her. But she took lessons in Fort Myers and she got her pilot's license, and then would go on to become the first female captain for American Airlines. And that was a big deal. And her family I think she flew from Dallas to Fort Myers, and she had all of her local folks there cheering her on. And she was also the youngest and the first female captain for, so she was both young and the first female. She was the first to command an all-female flight. So the flight crew, everybody on the crew was, and she was the first female to fly the Boeing 777, which was what she retired from, was the Boeing 777, and the one that became the plane that had to turn around and stay in Canada because of 9/11. Yeah. And then later on, it's because she spoke to some folks who were making a documentary about the planes that landed in Canada, in Gander, Canada, and the kindness, which is something we'd love to see more of in the world today, the kindness of the people there. Right. To help out everyone who was sort of stuck there on the planes. And ultimately, the Broadway musical Come From Away. And there's one song that's completely based on the story that Beverly Bass had told these documentary filmmakers, who said after they talked to Beverly Bass, they were ready to do Beverly Bass the musical because they thought her life was so fascinating. That's everything amazing. From starting off flying funeral planes, which is she flew bodies. That's how she got enough hours to be able to apply to American Airlines. Right. She flew bodies through basically Tornado Alley around Arkansas, Oklahoma. And she said the plane was so small, she had to climb over the body to get into the pilot's seat. Oh, my goodness. But she took all the jobs nobody else wanted, all the scut work, because she knew that's how she was going to get her hours so that then she could apply to American Airlines.
That's right. And she's also a co-founder of ISA 21, which is
the
Women's Airline Pilots Association. Yeah.
Correct.
Fascinating.
Yep.
Now, here's another one I haven't heard of, and I'm embarrassed by that, but glad that you brought her to light. Captain Patrice Clark Washington. And she went to Embry-Riddle, and she helps diversify commercial aviation is your tagline on her chapter.
Correct. She does. She was born in Nassau, Bahamas, and she was born to a poor family. And when they had someone come to speak, a lot of schools have somebody come and talk to students about, what potential careers they might have. And she heard about this thing about flying. And she used to fly on occasion as a passenger, of course, on a commercial airlines between the Bahamas and Miami, where she had family.
Mhm.
And she thought, I'll be a pilot. Her friends laughed at her. Yeah, woman pilot? No way. That's never going to happen. Your poor background? No, 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 no. Well, she had a very determined mother. And basically, her mother said, if this is truly what you want to do, she saved money. She worked hard, saved money for her daughter's tuition to be able to go to Embry-Riddle, and others in the community helped to pitch in financially. And she was the first Black female to attend Embry-Riddle University. And she said the day that she arrived, it was cold and rainy. And she looked out the window, and there she was, the only Black female. And she said, what have I done?
Yeah.
She thought, oh no, maybe I should turn around. But she knew her mother had said, nope, you can do this. If you want to do this, you can do this. And she stuck it out, and she became the first Black female alum of Embry-Riddle. She went on to become the first professional pilot in the Bahamas. And then from there became the first in the U.S., first Black female pilot flying for UPS.
Amazing.
And she was the first for any major airline service, and then this was in 1994, 88, she became the first female pilot, Black female pilot. And in 1994, she became the first Black female captain for any major U.S. air service. And so many of her hat, her jacket, various things, her wings, these are all in the Smithsonian now because she was the first to really break the color barrier for women in the aviation industry to be able to get into flying commercial planes.
Well,
Really quite a
I am
person.
so grateful that you highlighted her. I can't imagine how I have not run across her before, but now I have thanks to you. So thank
She
you
is
so much.
still alive, but she
Yeah.
lives a very private life. See, they
Ah,
say she
okay.
lives a very private life now in the Bahamas. She's back home but she
Oh.
was really, I mean, in the Women Fly exhibit of 1997, the one I have the T-shirt on,
Yeah.
there's some beautiful black and white photos. So if you go on to the Smithsonian website,
Yeah.
there's photos of her and other women of the era, and it's really quite beautiful. It's a great picture of her with her arms folded in front of a UPS plane, looking like she's got she's got the tiger by the tail. She looks
Good
fantastic.
for her. Good for her. Well, I'm so grateful to have heard her story. And now we get into a few characters, I will say, that I know personally. And one, the next one you've already mentioned, but I always talk about how I had posters of her on my wall when I was a teenager, hanging upside down in her plane. And then since then, in the past 5 years, I've had the opportunity to go fly with her, which was just, I mean, can you imagine like having
Oh,
a teen idol that you actually get to go do
that's
things like
fantastic.
like if I had a poster of like a rock star, I got to go sit on stage and sing with them. Like that's basically the equivalent of this in my life. So yeah, so talk about if you have anything else to say about Patty. We know that she has a school here in St. Augustine where she offers upset training and aerobatic training, and she's just been an icon
Well,
for
the
us.
interesting thing about her is, a lot of the women in the book, a number of them very early on in life were attracted to flying. Her
Yeah.
dad was a pilot.
Yeah.
Her sister Toni was a pilot, and she was like, not for me,
Right.
not for me. And
Yeah.
so she did a bunch of other things. I mean, she had basically got a business degree. I mean, she said, I don't really think I've got the discipline to be a pilot. It's not really what I want to do. And then one of her jobs was to work with the indigenous people in Alaska. And because she took sort of her project management skills and was helping them to administer grants and things like that for development of their community. And she met a man at that point in time, Bill Wagstaff, who basically said, hey, I'm going to show you how to, Bob Wagstaff, I'm going to show you how to fly a plane because this is what I have to do to get around. If you're going to get to these indigenous communities, they're pretty remote. So
Right.
there's no highway there. You're going to have to be able to fly at some point. And she got in the plane and he let her take the controls. And she said the moment she touched it, she realized, this is what I should have spent my whole life doing. So she
Yeah.
came to it much later. She was, I think, 28, 29. She was not one of these who did it as a teenager, like a Betty Skelton.
Yeah.
And so from there, she got hooked on it. I mean, she said it basically was kind of like an addiction at that point.
Yeah.
And then she trained with different people over time. And then she became this person who She won. Now, remember, when Betty Skelton won her trophies, it was when men and women, although they had the same routine to do, the same aerobatic routine, they competed against only people of the same gender.
Right.
Then it became something that, nope, now everybody competed, men and women competed against each other.
That's right.
And Patty Wagstaff did pretty well the first couple of times for somebody who was relatively new to the field. And then at one point in time, she won it. And
That's
people
right.
said, oh, it's a fluke. That's what I think really pushed Patty Wagstaff forward, is somebody telling her winning was a fluke. She was like, wait a minute. I kind of know what I'm doing here, right? So when she finally was, the first time a female had won was 1991. And then when somebody said to her, it's a fluke, that just fired her.
Yeah.
Got her really going, and she won it 2 more times. So she won it again, similar to Betty Skelton. She was a 3-time winner.
Right.
But she did it when men and women were competing against each other.
Yeah.
And then she became the second person to do an inverted ribbon cut. First was Betty Skelton, the first lady of first. And Patty Wagstaff was very, very kind and said, you know what? Everything I did, it seems like Betty Skelton had done it already.
Yeah.
But Patty is being very modest there, because Patty has done some, I mean, the kinds of planes she flies, they're like rocket ships now.
Yeah.
And she's just done incredible stuff. And she is now at 74, I think 75. She's still doing air shows.
Yep.
Still doing them. So
Yep.
she's someone who's had longevity that very few have. And she recently started a foundation to try to get scholarships to train other young people to become pilots. So good for her. She's then taken this legacy and it's going to carry on through this foundation, where she's going to try to help others learn about flying. She is quite a character.
She certainly is. Yeah.
Good for you. That must have been Liz, you got to tell me, what was it like being upset training with Patty Wagstaff?
I mean, it was a dream. It was incredible. She is clearly an expert at it and a professional. I obviously had some aerobatic training when I was in the at Navy flight training for the Coast Guard. And so it had been many, many years since I had done any of it. And I just was basically starstruck the whole time I was there. I mean, just even walking through her offices, which are like a museum.
Yeah,
you know, like
yeah,
just
absolutely.
Just
and
like
she came to Florida in part because of Florida's long tradition of flying circuses. Because she always said, I want to be close to the scene. The scene being, like when she went to her first air show, she went there. She had flown, but she had gone there as an audience member. And then when she saw the pilots hanging out, she thought, oh man, she said, I'm on the wrong side of the fence here.
Yeah.
I need to be over there.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why she went to St. Augustine, because there's a long history of aerobatic flying there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a pretty special experience. I recommend it for everybody. Okay. So now we get to another fun friend, Captain Linda Pfeiffer Powells. Linda Powells is the inspiration behind a couple of poetry books, featuring pilot poetry. So talk about Linda. And I know her, I actually had the pleasure of, hosting or emceeing her book launch party for the women pilots.
Great!
Women
That's
Pilots Write Poetry book.
awesome.
Yeah, we did that at Books and Books.
Oh,
down in
that's
Coral
they say
Gables.
that's a great place for those kinds of fantastic place for that.
It was absolutely wonderful. So yeah, tell us about Linda.
Well, she had a really difficult upbringing. Her father died when she was very young, and so she was born in Argentina, but her mom, because she was a single mom, she ended up spending a lot of her life in Miami, and she really did say it was very, very difficult for her to be away from her mother, but her mother had to try to support the family, and some people struggled at that time period. But she was born in Argentina. She grew up in Miami, and she became, like a lot of people, became very interested in flight. And she did not she was not in the military, so that's how a lot of people got their flying skills. She went to Miami-Dade Community College, and she would rent planes and get instructors and pay them by the hour to train her. So she did it really the hard way, but it was the only way that she was able to kind of cobble together the money to do it. And so once she became a pilot, she, of course, faced the difficulty of finding a job in the field. Very, very difficult. A lot of people would not hire women. She was a young woman. She was a Latina, so a lot of people didn't want to hire her for that reason. So she really had to fight to get through. But ultimately, it was in 1988. She flew for Southern Air Transport, And she was the youngest woman to be a jet captain. She was only 25 for a commercial airline. But again, it was flying cargo. It really wasn't, but she flew all over the world for Southern Air Transport. And then ultimately she applied to 12 years later, she became a captain for American Airlines. She was the first female Latina captain for American Airlines and the first Latina check airman. So she evaluated other pilots. And so she, again, flew a lot in and out of Miami. Her husband also is a pilot as well. And then later on during COVID, she knew that a lot of pilots were grounded because people were not flying.
That's right.
And so she decided, well, what could be a way I might be able to help the community? So there was a forum where people posted things. You know, the pilots posted different information or tried to help each other, you know, work out shifts and things like that. And she started to post poetry. Some people were like, this is a pilot forum. They shouldn't be posting poetry. And other people thought it was great. So other people started posting their own poetry in there. And she said haiku is a lot like the communication of pilots, which it has to be short, direct, and to the point when you're in the plane. So she started posting haikus and other people did. And then she thought, well, wait a minute. Why don't I pull together a collection of all this poetry? We can create a book, and then the monies from that book will go towards pilots and the pilots fund at that point, because many pilots said were unemployed. And she did do that. The first book was basically called Beyond Haiku.
Mm-hmm.
Pilots write poetry. Then she did a second book because it was so popular. Then she did a second one about women pilots writing poetry. And in that one, she broke some fresh ground that people did not know about, which is that before she was a pilot, Amelia Earhart loved to write. And she at one point in time thought she would be a creative writer and author. And she had written some short stories and she had written some poetry. And it was only really known by academics. A few scholars had, you know, done scholarly articles about her poetry. So Linda, no pushover, she contacted Purdue University and said, hey, we're doing this book on women pilots. Would you be willing to allow us to put some of Amelia Earhart's poetry? Because in her estate, she had left all of her papers to Purdue, where she had served as an academic advisor and a visiting professor. And they said yes. And so these poems, many of them unpublished, never had been seen before, ended up in the 2021 series Beyond Haiku, Women Pilots Write Poetry. And a lot of people were blown away. They had never known Amelia Earhart had written poetry. And then she's done one with short stories. So she now has this kind of, and Linda speaks different languages. She's a woman who loves language. So now she's got this kind of career as kind of a poet author as well. But she's been flying a long time, and she still works, I think, for American Airlines.
Yeah, so she's definitely still employed by American Airlines, and I am proud to say that I have a couple of excerpts of my own poetry alongside those poems.
No, Liz, you're
Yeah.
kidding. Which one is it in? Which book is it in?
In the Women Pilots Write
Okay,
Poetry.
I will look for that because I have that one. That's the one I own.
Yeah, I have a couple of pieces. They're like parts of poems that I wrote when I was in my Master of Fine Arts in Writing. And
no, that's great to hear. I didn't know you were also a writer along.
Oh, yes,
wow,
I
fantastic.
am.
Good for you, Liz.
And yeah, and one of my earliest interviews, probably like my third or fourth interview, was with Linda. So you can go listen to her talk about all of that stuff if you're
she's
interested.
lovely. I mean, she and I had several really long Zoom calls over an hour. She's just a fascinating person.
She sure is. She's
lovely.
Wonderful. A couple more left. The next one, oh my goodness, I have to confess, and if she listens to this, she's going to laugh. So I opened this book to chapter 13. Lucky 13. And it is a chapter dedicated to Lieutenant Colonel Christine Mao, now Christine Kelly, retired U.S. Air Force. And she is the first female F-35 pilot. And I spent some time with her last year at Sun and Fun. She came to be the keynote speaker at the 99's Trailblazer Luncheon, which is a luncheon because she did such a fantastic job. I volunteered to coordinate that luncheon for this past year. But it was really, really a special experience to hear her talk about her experience as a fighter pilot, then to see a picture in her presentation of her with she's the first F-35 pilot for the Air Force, but she is now a simulator trainer in the F-35 and has trained the past 2 female F-35 demonstration pilots. So I got to go from that out to the flight line for the night show and watch her student
Wow.
demonstrate the F-35 while I was sitting next to her. And what was going on the whole time that we were together was I was harassing her about telling her story and writing a memoir. And she just gave me like the hand, like, nope, that's not even a thing, that is never going to happen. And so when I cracked this book open, I took a picture and I texted it to her and I said, oh, okay, so you're holding out on me, I see.
Yeah.
Tell us
I don't
what
think
you
she wants to write about herself. She's
no.
not, I think she's a modest person. Like many of these women, and that's part of getting what I love about this book, Liz, is it gets the stories out of
Yeah.
these women, many of whom are very modest about their accomplishments. She was the first to lead an all-female combat mission in Afghanistan in 2011. She was the
And she was
first
flying the
female in the
F-15 then.
F-35
Yeah.
Lightning II pilot as well in
Yeah.
2013.
Yep.
So she sort of broke the barrier. Her first one was the F-15E Strike Eagle, and then their
Right.
second one was the F-35 Lightning II, which is an even much more advanced plane.
Yeah.
And then she said it was really tough when she came to retirement in 2017 because she really loved flying. But she's continued with Lockheed Martin. So she's basically an training instructor at their academic training center at Eglin Air Force Base up in the Panhandle in Florida.
Yeah.
But it was funny, the day I spoke to her, here's this pilot doing many things. At the same time, she was trying to, I think, create a birthday cake for one of her teenage daughters. So
Yeah.
she's also a mom trying to balance all that sort of life stuff at the same time.
Yeah.
But she's basically incredible that she did all of this stuff. And she did have some people give her kind of a hard time. But you know what? She said, I knew that the woman that came before me faced even greater headwinds.
Yeah.
And she was not going to be deterred by people who said, oh, you're not a real pilot or you can't be a pilot. Nope. She did not let herself get pushed around. And as I said, I like to say about her, she's a badass. She doesn't take anything
I
from
have been
anybody.
waiting
A
for you
total
to pause for
badass.
me. I have been waiting for you to pause for me to say that. Like she
Oh, yeah.
is just 100% badassery.
Oh, yeah.
Period.
And I love the way she has her arms folded in front of that jet like I own it.
That's
I own
right.
it.
That's
So
right.
she's fantastic. And like I said, she's like a lot of the women who came in, even Linda Powell had the same issue. Like they had children. And a lot of the times, like the military had to figure out how do you navigate a pregnant pilot. They didn't have to really do that until people like Christine Mount Kelly were involved, or Linda Powell when she was pregnant, and they had to sort of figure out, well, when could you fly and when could you cut it off?
Right.
And so all those kinds of things, these women had to sort of, pave the way for other women to come forward. But it's
And
really
we were
critical
still trying
that
to figure it out when I was doing it. And I
yeah,
came
exactly. Still trying to
so,
figure these things out. Even things like, for example, when Betty Skelton was training with the Mercury astronauts at that time, they did not have any uniform that fit her. So they put her in a pair of men's pajamas so she could do all the different things that she needed to,
yeah.
because they didn't have even the clothing for women.
Oh, no. Yeah. No, that's not surprising.
Things like that. Very basic stuff, but had to happen. And thanks to women like you guys, you sort of made it happen for women now. So never take it, I would say, don't take it for granted, because these women had to really pave a path against strong headwinds. And there are still some today who would not want to see women in the military, but I'm glad that these women have done it.
And I don't feel like the last chapter needs much, because we all know and love this wonderful woman who does have her own memoir that is fantastic. And I've also had the pleasure of not just interviewing her, but also supporting author events with her. And it just, I mean, from my perspective, like just to be in her presence is so inspiring. And I don't know. I can't even, like, I don't even have the words for Colonel Eileen Collins.
Yeah. And another one of these people came from a humble background.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And is still a humble person today. I mean, it's very, people say she's not one of these to talk herself up. She lives a somewhat private life now in Texas, but she does come out for certain different events. But she was incredible. And I think she was someone, I think the thing of what I think about her is patience. She had so much patience, because she waited a long, I mean, she did all of her work as a pilot and working her way through the military, but she had to be very patient to get her opportunity to first be the first female shuttle pilot in 1999. At one point, she thought she was going to get it, and then it didn't happen. And she was disappointed, but she said she was not going to let the disappointment show. She was going to continue to do her job like she should. And she did, and her patience paid off. And she became the first female shuttle pilot in 1999, carrying various mementos of women of the past who had flown, which I think was beautiful. And
That's
then
right.
became the shuttle commander in 1999, the first female shuttle commander of the entire
Mhm.
mission. And then after the terrible Columbia tragedy, she became the first in the return to flight, the first mission after the
Yep.
Columbia flight had had its terrible tragedy in 2005. And she was the one that did, if you have a chance at all, and if you go on YouTube and watch, there's video of her taking the space shuttle and basically doing a complete 360 with it. The first time that had done an end over end turn in space. No one had done it before
Oh,
because they wanted to see if the tiles on the bottom had been damaged in the
right.
initial launch of it so that it would be safer when they came back in, which had
Yep.
led, of course, to the terrible tragedy of the Columbia. And it's almost like watching a ballet to see her move it ever so slowly all the way. There were hundreds of cameras capturing this at the time. And it's beautiful. And I've seen some people have put music to it, like the Blue Danube music, waltz music. It's such a beautiful thing to see. But Eileen Collins, I wanted to finish with her because Ruth Law was in an era where there was fabric and wire, and you could get maybe a few thousand feet off the ground, but it was really an open cockpit to somebody now who was in space. I mean,
Yep.
that shows you the trajectory of women in aviation.
I absolutely loved it, and it was a perfect way to end it. And I have not seen that video, so I'm definitely going to go look
Oh,
for that.
you watch it, I've watched it a zillion times. I think it's just beautiful.
Well, and I imagine that that footage will be included in the new documentary that is coming out about Eileen Collins this year. I was just kind of digging to see if they've announced the launch date. They say it's going to be out for theatrical release in 2025, but it's Space Woman, and it is
Oh, I didn't
by,
know that there was
it's,
fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. It's well,
yeah.
way overdue.
No, of course. Yeah. So I'm really excited to see that come out. So, well,
Fantastic.
Lou, this has been incredible. This book is wonderful. It is just well written, well crafted, well researched, but it's not, it's not a tiny book, but it's an easy read is what I was trying to get to. It's an easy, enjoyable read where you can just sit down and read a chapter and then go do something else and come back to the book and get into the story of another fascinating character in our history, our collective history, both in Florida, in aviation, and in women's aviation. So thank you so much for the work
Thank
that you
you
did
too,
on
Liz.
this.
I've really enjoyed talking to you today. And I just want to say one of the things I always want to remind people that please don't forget these ladies. These
No,
stories have
exactly.
to be told. And we've done it in a way, I hope, in the book that's not like a dry, dull history book. It's these
Nope.
women's story, not just as pilots, but as people.
Yep.
And the great sort of adversities that they overcame in order to fulfill their dream of becoming a pilot. And it's amazing.
Absolutely. It's absolutely amazing, Lou. Thank you for your advocacy for women in the military in general and women in aviation, and for bringing your interest and the opportunity to write stories about Florida to this topic. Thank you so much.